I was 60 years old when I realized something I had been blind to for decades. I thought love was unconditional, that it came with a promise you could rely on forever. I thought if you stayed loyal, gave everything, and sacrificed quietly, it would always come back to you in the same way. But that's not how it works. Not really. Love doesn't leave suddenly. It doesn't collapse in a single moment. It changes quietly. One day, you notice a pause in someone's voice. One day, you notice a decision made without asking you, a subtle shift in warmth. And each time, it feels small, almost reasonable, and you dismiss it. That's what makes it so dangerous. I believed love was about endurance. I believed it was about staying, about giving without asking, about holding everything together so that the people around me could feel safe. I believed it with Marcos, when we built our lives together from scratch, when every step forward felt hard but shared, when everything we had came from effort and trust. Those early years felt simple. Survival made love obvious. But time doesn't stop. Comfort doesn't pause. And the rules start changing while you're still playing by the old ones. For years, I didn't notice the small compromises I made, the things I softened or ignored because I didn't want to rock the boat. I told myself these choices were reasonable, practical, necessary. And slowly, love started asking for more without ever saying so. It asked me to stay quiet, to stay small, to stay agreeable, to stay useful. And I did. Because it felt easier than facing the truth. I remember the morning I finally saw it clearly. I was standing in my living room, sunlight spilling across the floor. Everything looked normal. Nothing had happened. But something had. The warmth I had always felt from the people I loved depended on me staying exactly as I was. Not asking for more, not needing more, not changing. And in that moment, a thought surfaced that scared me. If love only exists when I stay small, what happens to it when I finally don't? It's easy to ignore, easy to dismiss. But the truth has a way of reaching you when you least expect it. Love had been conditional all along, and I had been paying the price without realizing it. And before I go any further, let me say this. If you're following along and something about this story feels familiar, something you felt quietly in your own life, maybe hit like and subscribe. Not because I'm asking for support, but because stories like this matter when we face them together. I stayed silent for so long because silence felt safe. I adjusted. I gave up a little each day. I softened my words, my needs, my expectations, and little by little, I noticed the distance growing. Not in a dramatic way, not in fights or shouting, but in the pauses, the choices made without me, the warmth that was always there only if I didn't disrupt it. And the hardest part? No one admits it. Love never hands you a warning. It lets you believe everything is fine. It rewards obedience quietly. And when you finally notice, when you finally see the pattern, you feel lost. You realize the life you thought was full of love was quietly defined by conditions you never agreed to. That morning, standing there, I understood it fully. I had been loved best when I was convenient, when I was predictable, when I didn't ask, and for decades I believed that was enough. But it wasn't. It was never enough. I don't know exactly how to describe that feeling. It's not anger. It's not sadness. It's a quiet, heavy recognition that things you trusted to be steady are not steady at all. And yet, that recognition carries a strange power, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. And that's where everything changes. The question that stayed with me, that I still carry, is simple but unbearable. If love has conditions, what happens when I refuse to meet them? After that morning, I couldn't stop noticing the small ways love had asked for my silence. It wasn't loud or obvious. There were no confrontations, no doors slammed, no words shouted across a room. Just quiet expectations I had carried for decades without even realizing it. I would offer an opinion, and it would be ignored. I would ask a question, and the answer would come only if it fit someone else's convenience. Every time, I told myself it was normal, that relationships were like this, that maybe I was being too sensitive. But the truth kept surfacing in tiny, undeniable moments. Marcos noticed it too, though we never said the words aloud. Sometimes his eyes would linger on me a second longer than usual, a subtle question in the glance. And I would look away, because looking back too closely might admit the truth I wasn't ready to face. For years, I believed that love was about holding on, that patience was a virtue. But patience had a cost. Every compromise I made, every word I softened, every feeling I tucked away became a small withdrawal from the account of my life. And one day, I realized I had been living on borrowed pieces of myself, giving away fragments of my identity in exchange for a quiet kind of approval. The irony is that the people who loved me most believed they were being generous. They thought that by keeping the peace, by smoothing over arguments, by rewarding my compliance, they were protecting me. But protection isn't love if it comes with rules you didn't agree to. And that was the cruelest part. No one ever admitted the rules. I discovered them only by breaking them or by refusing to notice them any longer. I began to see it everywhere. The children I raised, now adults, who expected me to show up on demand, who believed my loyalty was unconditional, who loved me best when I was convenient and compliant. The friends who would only call when it suited their schedule, who never asked how I was truly feeling. Even Marcos, as much as he loved me, had grown accustomed to a version of me that had been quietly edited over decades. And I had allowed it. Some days, I would sit alone in our bedroom, watching sunlight move across the floorboards, feeling the weight of what I hadn't said, of what I hadn't demanded. I realized that I had spent most of my life asking myself only one question: how can I stay loved? And not the deeper question, what do I want? I had been living as a reflection of others' expectations instead of the person I actually was. And that realization, it was terrifying. Because once you see it, you can't go back. The quiet compromises, the invisible debts you've paid, suddenly feel enormous. They weigh on you. They make you question every choice you've made, every sacrifice you thought was noble. And I couldn't help but wonder how many moments, how many years had been shaped not by love, but by the rules of conditional approval that I had silently agreed to without knowing it. And yet, recognizing it was also strangely liberating. The first time I admitted to myself that love had conditions, I felt a shiver of fear and a spark of possibility. Because seeing the truth means you can start to make different choices. You can start to define your life on your own terms, even if it's terrifying to step into that space. I started small. A word said clearly, a boundary drawn gently, a refusal that didn't feel like rebellion, but like breathing. And with each small step, I felt a piece of myself return. The part of me that had been quiet, compliant, overlooked, it was there still, waiting for permission to exist fully. And I began to give it that permission. It was not easy. Every choice, every boundary, every insistence on being seen as I was carried consequences. Faces would tighten. Voices would soften differently. Some love recoiled, some love adapted, and some love vanished entirely. And yet, each time I noticed the reaction, I felt more alive than I had in years. Because life lived under conditions isn't life fully lived. It's a shadow version. And I realized that I had been living in shadows for decades, believing them to be the light. And the truth hit me. The only way to reclaim real love, the only way to reclaim life, was to step into the discomfort, to allow myself to be seen fully and without compromise, even if it meant some people would step away. And so, I began. The days after that realization were strange. Ordinary routines suddenly felt heavier, like I was noticing weight I had been carrying without knowing it. Marcos would ask a simple question. About dinner, about bills, about plans for the weekend. And I would pause before answering, because I was weighing not just my words, but the history behind them, the compromises I had made to stay agreeable, the silences I had swallowed to keep love easy. I realized that for decades, I'd been negotiating with invisible rules, invisible expectations, and invisible limits, and it had shaped everything I did, every choice I made, every word I uttered. I started remembering moments from my past that had seemed small at the time, but now felt heavy. The dinners where I didn't voice an opinion because it might make someone uncomfortable. The conversations I avoided because asking too much was dangerous. The gifts I withheld because I didn't want to make anyone feel pressured. And now, looking back, I could see how much of myself I had ceded in the name of keeping the peace. It wasn't anger that rose in me. It was recognition, slow and insistent, like sunlight pushing through a curtain you've left closed for too long. Marcos noticed the change in me, though he never said anything directly. I think he sensed it in my pauses, in the way I held my hands when I spoke, in the silence that started to fill the spaces between us. And I could see the weight of his own realizations, that love, too, had been built on habits and compromises neither of us fully acknowledged. For the first time in years, we weren't just living side by side. We were noticing each other again, not in convenience or agreement, but in truth, messy and unpolished, raw with possibility. But noticing it was only the beginning. Seeing the conditions of love doesn't automatically free you from them. It doesn't undo decades of habit, of learned obedience, of soft compliance. I had spent so long giving what was expected, holding back what I needed, that the first moments of assertion felt almost unnatural. A simple request became a small act of courage. A word spoken fully without softening became a shock to everyone who had grown used to my quiet. And yet each act, no matter how small, reminded me that the self I thought I had lost was still there, patient, waiting, quietly stubborn. I started testing it, cautiously at first. A boundary drawn around my time, a preference stated clearly, a disagreement allowed without apology, and each time I felt a ripple. Some love recoiled, some adapted, some simply was. I realized that love had always been negotiating with me, but now I was stepping into the conversation for the first time. I was no longer silent. I was no longer invisible. And it was terrifying, and it was exhilarating all at once. I began to understand the true cost of living under conditions. It wasn't just the small compromises. It was the slow shrinking of desire, curiosity, and hope. It was the soft erasure of self, so subtle that you hardly notice it until one day, standing in your kitchen or sitting alone in a room, you feel the hollow echo of everything you stopped asking for, everything you stopped dreaming about, everything you softened until it no longer scared anyone, including yourself. That's the cost, and it's quiet, almost invisible, until you finally see it. And yet, once you see it, you can't unsee it. That quiet realization becomes a kind of reckoning. The life you thought you were living for, love, was only partially yours, and the love you thought was unconditional. It wasn't. It had conditions all along, and now that I knew, I couldn't go back to pretending, I couldn't ignore it, I couldn't keep shrinking myself to fit the spaces others had unconsciously drawn around me. I started making small choices differently, choosing words that reflected what I actually felt, choosing moments that mattered to me, not just to keep everyone else comfortable, choosing presence over acquiescence. Each decision was a small act of reclaiming a self I thought I had lost, and with every act I felt pieces of life returning, bright and raw and alive. And the strangest thing happened as I began to assert myself. The people who truly loved me adjusted. They learned to love me as I was, not as the quiet, compliant version they had taken for granted. Some relationships strained, some cracked, some grew deeper than I could have imagined. And I realized that love can change, not disappear, but transform when you refuse to be defined by the conditions others impose. And even though the steps were small, tentative, and sometimes frightening, I felt the pulse of life returning in ways I hadn't felt in years. The weight of silent compromise was lifting. The rules that had once bound me were no longer invisible. I could see them, I could name them. and I could choose not to obey them anymore. I began noticing how much of my life had been shaped by what I thought love demanded rather than what I truly wanted. Small things at first, deciding where to sit at the table, what words to soften, which opinions to hide. Then bigger things, moments where I held back from pursuing opportunities, speaking my truth, or asking for what I needed because I thought love required it. And slowly, over years, I realized that the rules I had followed weren't written by anyone. They were assumed. They were invisible expectations that everyone seemed to agree upon without ever discussing, and I had followed them without question. Marcos watched me change, though he never interfered. I could sense him observing quietly, measuring, trying to understand the new rhythm of our life. And I realized that love, even the love that is steady and familiar, can quietly accommodate conditions without anyone pointing them out. You think you are giving freely, and yet each day the freedom you claim is measured, weighed, and graded against what is acceptable, what is convenient, what is quiet. For decades, I had been bending, giving, agreeing, silencing, and I hadn't noticed the slow shrink of my own desires. It was in ordinary moments that the truth revealed itself. A question I wanted to ask, a request I wanted to make, a word I wanted to say. And each time I hesitated, I felt the old patterns pressing in, reminding me how things had always been. Love was conditional, not because anyone intended cruelty, but because it was easiest to reward compliance and discomforted by assertion. I saw it not just in Marcos, but in the people around me. Children, friends, colleagues, all unconsciously following the same invisible rules. I had learned them so well that I didn't even see them until I began to question. The first time I drew a line, I felt guilty immediately. A small boundary, something I needed for myself. And yet the relief was undeniable. The air shifted. The energy in the room changed slightly. Not everyone was happy. Some were uncomfortable. But that discomfort was nothing compared to the quiet suffocation I had felt for decades. And for the first time in years, I understood that asserting myself didn't end love. It revealed it. It filtered out the love that relied on my silence from the love that could withstand my voice. I began testing myself in little ways, saying what I wanted instead of what I thought would please, speaking when I had previously stayed quiet, requesting time or space I had never taken. And each small act built on the last. Each one chipped away at the invisible rules that had governed my life. And with each act, I felt more real, more alive, more present in the life I had been coasting through as a quiet observer rather than a participant. It wasn't easy. Sometimes I felt afraid because reactions were unpredictable. Sometimes love recoiled, sometimes it adapted, and sometimes it simply revealed that it had never been unconditional in the first place. And yet, that knowledge was liberating. I realized that the life I had accepted for decades wasn't wrong, but it wasn't mine entirely. It had been shaped by others' comfort, by what they were willing to give without disruption. And that quiet shaping had almost erased me. Marcos and I began having conversations differently. Not arguments, not confrontations, but pauses filled with recognition, questions asked with care, feelings expressed without expectation of approval. Love was still there, but it was more honest. And I could feel my own power return, the power to claim my life, my words, my choices. The power to ask for what I needed without fear of rejection. The power to refuse silence. And through it all, I realized something profound. Living under conditions is subtle but devastating. It teaches you to measure your desires, to compress them, to tuck them away. And when you finally notice, you are left with years of untapped hopes and quiet regrets. But noticing it is the first step toward reclaiming yourself. I began to understand that love's conditions aren't always cruel, but they are always limiting. They shape you in ways you don't recognize until you step back. And once you see them, you can't go back to pretending. You can't ignore the weight you've carried. You can't pretend it doesn't matter. And so I began to live differently. Small steps first, words spoken fully, needs expressed clearly, boundaries honored, and with each step I felt a piece of the life I had almost forgotten return, bright, raw, and undeniably mine. The more I claimed my own space, the more I noticed how deeply I had been accustomed to adjusting. Every word I had softened, every request I had swallowed, every feeling I had hidden. They had been bricks in the walls of other people's comfort, and those walls had quietly shaped my life. I had believed that love required sacrifice, patience, and quiet endurance. But now I saw the cost. The cost was subtle, slow, but immense. Years spent giving pieces of myself I didn't even realize I had taken for granted. It wasn't just Marcos. It was my children, my friends, even strangers who expected me to be a certain way. I had been living a version of myself that fit within their expectations, and it had become my default. I had believed that being agreeable, dependable, quiet, and accommodating was proof of love, proof of worth, proof of life, well lived. And for decades, I had measured my success by how well I disappeared into everyone else's needs. The realization was both terrifying and liberating. I started small. A word spoken clearly, a boundary drawn without apology, a request made for the first time in years. The reactions were immediate and revealing. Some people recoiled, some people adjusted, and some, quietly, were never willing to see me as I truly was. And that, more than anything, hurt. Because I had believed that love was infinite, unconditional, and forgiving. And I discovered it isn't always. Sometimes love requires obedience. Sometimes love asks you to hide your edges, to mute your voice, to shrink so it fits more comfortably around others. Marcos noticed the changes in me, though he never intervened. I could see him trying to measure me, trying to understand how much of this new version of me was necessary and how much threatened the life we had built together. For the first time, we were not just living side by side. We were negotiating, cautiously, carefully, the space we had given each other, the love that had always existed in quiet, invisible patterns. And I began to understand that love is not just about giving, it is also about receiving and being allowed to exist fully. I found myself recalling decades of compromise, moments I had softened until they were unrecognizable, choices I had made that left me feeling smaller, quieter, less significant. And I realized how much of myself I had ceded, how much of my life had been shaped not by desire or truth, but by the invisible conditions of others' comfort. And I wondered, how much longer could I continue to live this way without losing the self I had spent a lifetime cultivating quietly within? Each small assertion of my needs was a revelation. I could feel the life I had almost forgotten returning. My curiosity, my wants, my voice. It was as though I had been sleeping in plain sight, giving pieces of myself away while believing I was keeping them safe. And now, speaking them aloud, claiming my space, I realized that reclaiming myself was not just an act of courage, but a necessity. The longer I waited, the more invisible I would become. And yet, it was never simple. Each step brought resistance, even from those I loved most. Their discomfort mirrored mine from decades earlier. I had been accustomed to being quiet to avoid discomfort, but now discomfort became a sign of truth. The more I asserted myself, the clearer it became who was willing to love me as I was, and who had been conditioned to love only the version of me that disappeared to make them comfortable. Some mornings, I would sit alone in the sun streaming through the windows, and I would let myself feel it. The weight of years, the lost moments, the unspoken words, the compromises. And then I would let it go, because holding on to it meant nothing. Recognizing the truth, naming it, giving myself permission to exist fully, that was enough to start moving forward. I realized something profound. Love's conditions are rarely spoken. They are learned, absorbed, felt over time, and breaking them requires not anger, not rebellion, but courage. Quiet, steady, deliberate courage. Courage to say the words you've held back. Courage to ask for what you need. courage to reclaim the parts of yourself that were given away in the name of harmony. And with each act of courage, I felt the invisible walls shifting. My world was expanding. The space I claimed for myself became a place where love could exist without conditions, where connection could be real, and where I could participate fully in life rather than simply observing it. I understood, finally, that reclaiming love and self was not a single moment. It was a process, built one quiet, deliberate choice at a time. And even though it was frightening, even though some love left because it had never been unconditional, the life I was reclaiming felt more alive than anything I had ever known. By the time I reached 60, I could no longer ignore the quiet cost of conditional love. I had lived most of my adult life adjusting, softening, shaping myself to fit the expectations of others. At first, it seemed harmless. A small compromise here, a polite silence there, a thought softened so as not to offend. But over the decades, those tiny adjustments had accumulated until the life I thought I was living felt smaller, muted, as if someone had quietly taken pieces of me without asking. I started noticing patterns I had always dismissed. The way people reacted to my words, to my needs, to my wants. The way affection seemed to depend on my compliance, my quietness, my willingness to disappear when it was convenient for everyone else. And in that realization, I felt the weight of every ignored impulse, every softened dream, every time I had believed that obedience was love. I understood that love had been conditional all along, subtle, quiet, invisible. And I had never seen it because I had been too busy fitting inside it. Marcos noticed too. I could see it in his eyes, the way he hesitated before speaking, as if recalibrating how to engage with the woman he had always thought he knew. For the first time, he and I were facing the consequences of the lives we had built together under assumptions. No one had spoken the rules aloud, and yet we had both been following them. And now that I was stepping into my truth, I could feel the old balance shift. Some love bent to accommodate me. Some resisted. Some quietly slipped away. But each reaction revealed the reality I had been too afraid to acknowledge for decades. Love without conditions is rare, and claiming it requires courage. The first time I spoke plainly about my needs, I felt a spark I hadn't felt in years. It was terrifying because the reactions weren't predictable. Some recoiled, some paused, some adjusted, but inside me a pulse returned. My voice, once silenced, was being heard, and that act alone reminded me of who I had been before the years of quiet compromise had reshaped me. I realized that reclaiming myself wasn't about confrontation, it wasn't about anger or rebellion, it was about truth. Saying what I wanted, what I needed, what I deserved, even if it made others uncomfortable. It wasn't easy. Old habits die hard. The patterns of silence and compliance had been reinforced for decades. Every word I softened, every request I withheld, every compromise I accepted, they had become instinct. And breaking them meant stepping into a discomfort I hadn't faced in years. But I began to see the difference. The life I reclaimed felt raw, vibrant, alive in a way that quiet obedience never had. I noticed small but profound shifts in my relationships. Conversations became deeper, more honest. Marcos and I started listening differently, really listening. My children began to respect boundaries I had never enforced. Friends started noticing the edges of my personality I had tucked away. And even in the moments of tension or resistance, I felt a sense of liberation that I had never known before. Because liberation isn't loud. It's quiet, deliberate, and it comes from insisting on your existence. And in those quiet moments alone, I reflected on the years I had spent bending, softening, shrinking, all in the name of love that had always required compliance. I saw clearly how much of my life had been shaped by invisible expectations. And I understood that the love that is truly unconditional doesn't ask you to disappear. It doesn't reward silence or obedience. It simply sees you fully and chooses you even when you are raw, flawed, and demanding. By now, I could feel a tension between the life I had lived and the life I was reclaiming. It wasn't a simple choice, it was a constant negotiation between comfort and truth, between what was safe and what was real. And yet, every time I chose to step into my truth, I felt a surge of life I had almost forgotten. I remembered the woman I had been before compromises became routine, before silent obedience became habit, before love's conditions went unnoticed. I realized that reclaiming my voice, my presence, my choices wasn't just about me. It was about redefining what love could be around me. It was about teaching those I loved that true connection requires presence, honesty, and permission to exist fully. It was about showing that boundaries, needs, and truth aren't threats. They are the foundation for real love. And with each day, each small act of courage, each insistence on being seen, I felt my life returning. Piece by piece, voice by voice, desire by desire, I reclaimed the self that had been quietly shaped to fit the expectations of others. And I knew, in that quiet power returning to me, that I would never let love's conditions define who I am again. This is where everything came together. After decades of adjusting, softening, and shaping myself to fit the expectations of others, I finally understood the weight I had been carrying, the quiet cost of conditional love. Every compromise I had made, every word I had softened, every feeling I had hidden, had built walls I didn't even realize existed. And now I was standing on the other side of those walls, finally seeing the world and myself clearly. Marcos and I had shifted too. We weren't just living together anymore. We were noticing each other, truly noticing in ways we hadn't in years. The love we had built had survived decades of routine and compromise, but it had been quiet, cautious, measured. And now, as I reclaimed my voice and my needs, it was alive in a different way, raw, honest, and real. Some love bent to meet me, some struggled, and some disappeared entirely. But each reaction revealed the truth I had been avoiding. Love is not always unconditional. And to live fully, I had to be willing to face that. I thought of all the moments I had silenced myself, all the times I had held back because I thought it was easier to be compliant, safer to be agreeable. I realized that life spent adjusting for others isn't life fully lived. The cost isn't dramatic. It doesn't hit in one explosive moment. It's subtle, slow, almost invisible. But one day, when you stop and truly see, you notice the missing chapters. The conversations never had, the dreams softened, the words never spoken. And that recognition is heavy. It was terrifying at first to speak my truth, to assert my needs, to reclaim my space. Old habits die hard, and decades of silence can make your own voice feel unfamiliar. But each word I spoke, each boundary I honored, each moment I refused to shrink brought pieces of me back to life. The quiet pulse I had almost forgotten grew stronger. And with each act of courage, the invisible walls around me started to crumble. I began to see clearly how conditional love had shaped not just my relationships, but my very sense of self. I had been living a life designed to avoid conflict, avoid discomfort, and avoid rejection. I had measured myself by how much I could disappear, how quiet I could be, how compliant I could remain. And I had almost forgotten what it felt like to exist fully, to be seen fully, to be loved, not for my silence, but for my truth. Some relationships adapted, some fell away. Some grew deeper than I could have imagined. And through it all, I realized a fundamental truth. Love that asks you to disappear is not love. Love that is conditional shapes you into someone you barely recognize. And claiming real love, claiming real life, requires courage. Quiet, steady, deliberate courage. Courage to speak, courage to demand space, courage to exist fully, even if it threatens the patterns of decades. And now I could finally say it aloud. I am reclaiming myself. I am reclaiming my voice, my choices, my presence. And in doing so, I am choosing life, not compliance. I am choosing authenticity, not convenience. I am choosing truth, not comfort. And each small choice, each act of assertion is a victory against the quiet demands that tried to shape me for years. Before I end, I want to pause here and say this. If my story resonates with you, if it sparks something inside, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Sharing these stories helps us all remember that even late in life, we can reclaim the parts of ourselves that were lost or ignored. And I promise you, it's never too late. The truth is, love is complex. Life is complex. And sometimes, the people we cherish most expect us to fit inside invisible boxes. But the life that is fully yours, the love that is real, demands that you exist fully, unapologetically, and courageously. You don't need permission from anyone to reclaim your voice, your choices, your joy. And when you do, everything changes. So here's my final thought. Love may have conditions, and people may fail to see the real you. But you can choose to live fully anyway. You can choose truth, presence, and courage. You can speak your words, claim your space, and honor yourself, no matter the cost. Because life is happening now, and every day you wait, you risk losing more chapters of the story you were meant to live. And as I stand here, looking back at the decades I've lived and forward to the time I still have, I know this. I am no longer shrinking. I am no longer silenced. I am alive, fully, fiercely, and unapologetically. And that, more than anything, is the gift of seeing love clearly, even if it comes late.